Hey everyone, tonight we're trading soft pillows for togas, funeral masks, and the eerie stillness of an ancient Roman procession. Forget modern ceremonies with quiet music and soft words. In Rome, funerals were theatrical, political, and often overwhelming, complete with hired mourners, loud horns, and the occasional riot. Imagine waking up to find yourself expected to wail convincingly in public, carry a heavy wax mask of your great-grandfather, or walk barefoot behind a chariot while someone recites your failures aloud, and that's before the cremation starts. You wouldn't get a moment to reflect. You'd be too busy performing grief for the crowd, dodging falling flower garlands, and wondering why the guy next to you is juggling bones. Respect, optional. Chaos, guaranteed. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, let your mind wander, and allow the gentle rhythm of my voice to lull you towards sleep. Maybe settle in, pull your blanket a little closer, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you were hoping for a moment of peace now that you're dead, sorry. You've barely exhaled your final breath, and already a neighbour is asking whether she can borrow your amphora collection for just a few days. Because in Rome, dying was only the beginning. The moment you hit the floor, or more accurately, your litter, chaise lounge or lavatory, a protocol begins. Not the clean, sanitised kind with medical gloves and whispering nurses. Number. This is the loud, messy, deeply superstitious parade of mourning that begins with a ritual shout and ends, days later, with your possibly haunted ashes being shoved into a wall next to your least favourite cousin. You're lying there, dead. Ideally on the 9th day of illness, because 9 was a magical number. Or maybe you were just getting over a mild cold and tripped over your own toga. It doesn't matter. You've expired. And in Roman terms, that means your body is now considered dangerous. Spiritually dangerous. The first step? Close your eyes. No, not you. You're dead. Someone, usually the eldest son, or the next available man in the household, must physically close your eyelids. Leaving them open was a big no-no. Open eyes meant your soul might still be lurking, watching, judging, maybe hanging around to possess the family goat. Then comes the shout. Yes, someone must call your name 3 times, loudly, conclamatio, to inform the underworld you've officially clocked out of life. Why the gods need a roll call, no one knows. But skipping this step? Absolutely not. You don't want to be that guy whose ghost gets stuck wandering the atrium whispering, "Hello, I think I died." And now the mourning begins. Except in Rome, mourning wasn't quiet. It was theatrical. Women tear at their hair, scratch their cheeks, beat their chests. And that's if they liked you. If you were wealthy, you could hire professional mourners. Entire guilds of women trained to cry on demand, sob in rhythm, and occasionally shout about how noble and generous you were even if you weren't. You might be tempted to feel flattered. Don't. These women are loud, shrill, some carry cymbals. They have one job and it's to ruin everyone's sleep. Also, the more dramatic the display, the more people thought, wow, he must have been important. If your funeral didn't wake the neighbours, were you even Roman? But the body isn't buried yet. No, no. First, it has to be prepared. Washed, usually in warm water, scented with myrrh or rosemary. Dressed in your best toga, preferably the white one with the purple stripe if you are anyone of note. Laid out in the atrium with coins over your eyes to pay Sharon, the underworld ferryman, a sprig of cypress by the door to warn guests of death within, and a constant stream of visitors coming to pay their not-so-respectful respects. Expect commentary like, "He looks thinner than I remember," or "Was this atrium or was this dusty?" Or, "Do you think his son will inherit the villa?" And then there's the will. Yes. It gets read almost immediately, while your body is still in the room. Prepare for drama. If you disinherited someone or left your fortune to a mistress or made a joke in the margins. To Gaius, I leave my collection of empty amphorae. He always loved useless things. It's all coming out now. And if you think that might lead to a lawsuit, congratulations. You've just unlocked the bonus level, posthumous court battle coming later. Your body's not ready. We haven't even reached the procession, the cremation, or the banquets. You still have several days left of being the main character, and ironically, you're not even conscious for it. Let's imagine you died on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, your home smells like rosemary, wine, sweat, and apprehension. Your neighbours have stopped pretending they're sad and are now openly speculating about who's going to get your garden plot. And your body? It's starting to settle, which means it's time to go, but not to rest, to parade. Because in Rome, funerals weren't subtle affairs. They were pageants, moving theatre through the narrow, overcrowded, gloriously unsanitary streets of the city. The funeral procession was your one and only chance to posthumously show off. So your family was going to do everything they could to make you look more impressive, dead than you ever were alive. First, the actors. Yes, actors. Hired to dress up as your ancestors. They would wear masks, imagines, moulded to look like your most heroic, aristocratic and extremely dead relatives. These weren't meant to be flattering likenesses. They were intentionally grim, aged, dignified. The message was, look how important this man was. He had ancestors with cheekbones like marble and public offices to their names. These ghostly actors would march at the front of the procession, solemn and slow, reenacting the grand lineage of your bloodline. Even if you'd only made it to the Roman equivalent of middle management, someone would figure out a way to claim you were descended from a general who conquered at least one barbarian, preferably two. Behind them, musicians, not the gentle harp-strumming kind. Think tubas, flutes, drums, and cymbals. Roman funeral music was less about mourning and more about sonic domination. You wanted to wake every soul in a 5-block radius. If someone didn't throw open their shutters and shout who died, the band wasn't doing its job. Next came the mourners, your family, actual and fabricated. The more chaos they caused, the better. Screaming, throwing themselves onto the cobblestones, fainting from grief. It was all part of the aesthetic. Your widow was expected to be the most dramatic of all. Ideally, she would collapse at least once during the route. If she didn't cry enough, or seemed suspiciously well dressed, rumours would begin before your pyre was even lit. Maybe she was glad you were gone. Maybe she'd been seeing the baker. Maybe she poisoned your garum. And there, in the middle of it all, you. On a bier carried by slaves or hired bearers, wrapped in your finest toga, arms folded like a wax statue. Depending on your wealth, you might also be surrounded by flowers, perfume burners, and occasionally a small boy fanning away flies. You might be thinking, why not just go quietly? Because quiet didn't get you remembered. Quiet didn't secure your family's social status. A Roman funeral was political theatre with a corpse at centre stage. Eventually the procession made its way to the Forum Romanum, not the cemetery. That came later. First, the eulogy, delivered by your eldest male heir or a respected relative. possibly in tears, possibly slightly drunk. They would stand before a gathered crowd and list your accomplishments. If you didn't have any, they'd make some up. He once convinced a senator to lend him 4 donkeys. He could recite Virgil backward. He never spilled wine on his tunic. Not once. It wasn't about accuracy. It was about dignity, image, legacy. The Romans believed your reputation in death could retroactively improve your life. Think of it as PR after expiration. After the speech, the crowd might cheer or cry or politely nod, depending on how long you'd made them stand in the sun. Then came the final journey. You were carried out of the city. Because Romans, with all their enthusiasm for death rituals, did not want corpses within the sacred city boundary. It was a religious line. The pomerium and your decomposing self had no business being inside it. So off you went, to the necropolis, which means quite literally city of the dead. Now came the decision, cremation or burial. If this was early Rome, cremation was all the rage. Fire was cleansing, transformative. Your body would be laid on a wooden pyre with offerings of food, wine, incense, and possibly that one tunic you always hated. Your family would circle you 3 times. Then someone, usually a close male relative, would light the pyre. The flames would rise, and so supposedly would your soul. But Roman cremations weren't quick or clean. They took hours. People would bring folding chairs. Children got bored. Someone inevitably spilled wine. And yes, there were rules about which bones to collect afterward. The ashes were swept, sorted and placed in an urn. Usually terracotta, sometimes marble. Almost never gold. Even dead you were expected to show restraint. The urn was then buried or placed in a columbarium, a sort of communal tomb wall, honeycombed with niches. Some of these were family-owned. Others belonged to funerary societies, clubs where members paid monthly dues to ensure they wouldn't be dumped into a pit someday. Because if you died poor with no connections and no society to back you up, that's where you went. A mass grave, no eulogy, no parade, no tubas. But let's say you were lucky. You had a good send-off. People cried, coins were thrown, your enemies pretended to mourn. Then came the real test. What happened afterward? Because Romans didn't stop grieving once the fire was out. Oh no! You still had at least 9 days of ritual purification, feasts, offerings, and elaborate dinners where people toasted your memory while absolutely butchering your favourite recipes. And if you think this was the end, just wait. Your soul hasn't even reached the underworld yet. There are rivers to cross, judges to bribe, and somewhere inevitably a priest sacrificing a chicken in your name while muttering that you were mostly all right. By the 10th day after your death, if your family followed tradition, they held a feast in your honour, not just any feast. This was the Cena Novendialis, and it marked the official end of mourning. Or at least, that's what everyone claimed while quietly judging your relatives' togas for being just a little too clean. The idea was simple. Eat, drink, and symbolically invite your soul to move along. From the world of the living to wherever exactly Roman ghosts went when they stopped rattling. Amphory. But you, dear listener, wouldn't be going quietly. Your shade, your umbra, might still be lingering around your home, peeking over shoulders, tipping over cups. Romans believed that improperly mourned or inadequately buried spirits had the potential to stick around like spiritual mildew. That's why your family would continue placing food offerings on your tomb long after your ashes had cooled. Lentils, beans, bread soaked in wine. You might even get honey cakes if your grandson didn't eat them first. Your tomb, if you were lucky, might be positioned along one of Rome's famous roads, the Appian Way being a prime choice. These weren't peaceful countryside resting spots. They were prime real estate for eternal visibility. Romans buried their dead just outside city limits, but they did so conspicuously. They wanted passers-by to see their names, read their epitaphs, and maybe mutter, "Ah, yes, Gaius Flavius, decent fellow, excellent taste in statues." Tombs came in all shapes and sizes, simple stones with scratched inscriptions, small shrines with carved reliefs, even grand mausoleums with columns and benches for visitors. The wealthier the deceased, the more elaborate the monument, because even in death you were competing for memory, for prestige, for a spot on the mental map of anyone walking by. But for all the stone and ceremony, what the Romans truly feared was oblivion. Not hell, not divine punishment, just being forgotten. So families went to great lengths to preserve the memory of their dead. They held regular banquets at the gravesite. They invoked the name of the deceased during special festivals like the Parentalia. A week in February, when all proper Roman citizens were expected to visit the tombs of their ancestors, leave offerings, and avoid any loud celebrations that might offend the dead. During this week, the streets around the necropolises were crowded, not with ghosts, but with the living doing their best impersonation of respectful grief. Children played near the tombs, vendors sold snacks nearby, and somewhere a teenage cousin muttered about how many funerals he'd been forced to attend this year. Still, traditions were kept. You might even get a small statue placed near your urn, a little reminder that someone somewhere remembered your name. Now what about those who didn't get all this? The ones whose funerals were rushed, whose urns never found a niche, whose families ran out of money or interest? The answer was the lemures. These were the angry dead, restless, resentful. They haunted crossroads, disturbed dreams, whispered in ears. The Romans had a festival just to appease them, the Lemuria. During those nights, the head of the household would walk barefoot through the house at midnight, tossing black beans over his shoulder and muttering incantations to banish the lurking shades. Why black beans? Because apparently nothing says "move on, you're dead" like legumes, and if that didn't work well, people might start seeing your shadow in candlelight, hearing your sighs, wondering why the bread never rose in your old oven. Being a Roman ghost wasn't about moaning in a crypt. It was about unfinished business and the people you left behind failing to do their jobs. Still, some dead were honoured beyond their wildest dreams. Emperors became gods, literally. Through a ceremony called apotheosis, their souls were declared divine and sent skyward, sometimes with the help of an eagle released theatrically during the cremation. The common citizen might not get a bird, but a well-loved merchant or a respected teacher could still have a statue, a plaque, or at least a poorly carved bust that only vaguely resembled them. And what about the slaves, the freedmen, the ones who never expected much from life, let alone death? They had their own ways. Funerary clubs, as mentioned before, offered them a chance at dignity. Members paid into a communal fund to ensure a proper burial. These clubs often had their own rituals, their own gravestones, sometimes even poetry. A freedman's epitaph might read like a novel compressed into 5 lines. Here lies Marcus, once a slave, who loved wine, dice, and his wife, not always in that order. In these tombs the dead weren't just remembered, they were introduced. Their stories, compressed into marble, became part of the city's collective memory. You might walk past a tomb and learn more about a fishmonger's romantic disappointments than you ever wanted to. But you'd remember him, and that was the point. All of this, from the parade to the pyre to the poetry, was about more than mourning. It was about defiance, a refusal to vanish. In a city built to outlive empires, the Romans fought to etch their existence into its very stones. And if they couldn't, they haunted you until you did it for them. You might think that after the ashes cooled and the epitaph was etched, the story would end. But no, in Rome, death had a social afterlife. And yours, dear listener, was about to be judged not just by the gods, but by neighbours with very strong opinions on gravestone typography. Roman funerals, like most things in Roman life, were exercises in performance. And the final act of that performance was legacy, not just memory, public memory. You weren't truly dead until people stopped talking about you, stopped arguing about whether your statue should have had more realistic calves, or whether your final banquet was a bit too light on garum. Let's talk about tomb inscriptions. These were not humble. If anything, they were your last desperate chance to curate how you'd be remembered. Modesty was rare. A typical epitaph didn't just say, "Here lies Publius." It said something like, "To the spirits of the departed, here lies Publius Aelius Fortunatus, freedman of Aelius, who served faithfully for 27 years, loved by all, hated by none, who gave generously to his community, and owned the best fig tree on the Via Latina." And that was the abridged version. The long ones went on for paragraphs, detailing moral character, number of children, generosity and festivals, and, of course, how devastatingly unfair it was that the gods took such a noble soul at just 47, or 57, or 77. Age was always negotiable in death. Some tombs featured curses. These were stern warnings to grave robbers, vandals, and nosy teenagers. May whoever disturbs this tomb be cursed by Pluto, and never know peace, in life or death. That sort of thing. Charming, really. Romans didn't just fear being forgotten, they feared being disrespected. And what better way to ensure respect than to threaten eternal torment for anyone who moved your urn to make room for a newer, flashier neighbour? Meanwhile, families returned regularly. It wasn't a one-and-done affair. There were annual rituals. The Feralia, for instance, was a solemn day of offerings to the dead. Families visited tombs, laid out food, poured wine, and whispered names. It was less about ghostly gratitude and more about civic duty, like showing up at a voting booth if the ballot box judged you for eternity. You, however, were mostly powerless in all this, unless you'd somehow arrange for a testamentum, a formal will with stipulations. Some of these were simple. Leave 3 denarii to each slave. Others were, shall we say, elaborate, like requiring your heir to hold annual gladiatorial games in your name, or to commission a statue of you, preferably equestrian, preferably heroic, and preferably taller than the one your cousin got last year. Ah, family dynamics. Even in death the jostling continued. Disinherited sons contested wills. Greedy nephews haggled over funeral expenses. Widows made subtle edits to gravestone poetry. And through it all, priests of the College of Pontiffs ensured that every ritual remained technically correct, if not emotionally sincere. And then there were the funerary cults. Not sinister, not secret. Just small groups of Romans who gathered to remember, to preserve, to ritualize grief. Sometimes they revolved around a single family. Other times they centered on a figure so beloved that generations kept his flame burning. These cults kept death active. They didn't just mourn, they maintained a kind of gentle surveillance on the living, a reminder that someone, somewhere, was still paying attention to how you spoke about Great Uncle Lucius. Among all this, your shade, that incorporeal bit of you that refused to leave the mortal world entirely, floated between shadows. Not in agony, not in peace, but in a kind of waiting room of eternity, eavesdropping on gossip, watching someone replace your statue's wreath with a cheaper version, and wondering why your old neighbour was buried closer to the road than you were. You'd paid extra for that spot, you're fairly sure. Children, too, had their place in this system of remembrance. Their graves often featured touching, if slightly sanitized, depictions. Little boys playing with hoops, girls with birds or dolls. Inscriptions mourned what they could have been. Lawyers, priestesses, brave citizens. They were immortalized as potential, preserved forever in an idealized, innocent freeze frame. But perhaps the most haunting truth of Roman funerary culture was this: the dead lived on in the words of the living. That's why you, even now, are being remembered. Because someone, somewhere, carved your name into stone, poured wine on your grave, or muttered your name during a festival. Because you once mattered, and the Romans, ever pragmatic, ever theatrical, believed that mattering was a choice you had to reinforce every year. And if no one came, if the offering stopped, if the names were forgotten, if ivy overtook the marble and rain wore the letters down, then perhaps your umbra truly moved on. Or perhaps, just perhaps, it wandered, waiting for someone to remember, or for someone to forget just long enough for your story to start again. Now let's say your funeral went off with only a few minor mishaps. A spilled amphora, an awkward eulogy, a freedman who cried just a little too enthusiastically for someone who once tried to poison your dog. But before your shade can start haunting the living or loitering near the family tomb, we need to talk about real estate. Not the kind with atriums and impluviums, but tomb plots. You see, dying in Rome wasn't just a spiritual journey, it was a property concern. Roman burial was illegal within the sacred boundary of the city, the pomerium, so the dead lived, metaphorically, along the roads outside the city walls. This meant that in death, as in life, location was status. The Via Appia, the Via Latina, the Via Flaminia. These were the park avenues of the underworld. The closer your tomb to the city, the more important you were, or the more you were willing to bribe the right officials. Tombs came in many shapes. Humble niches in communal columbaria for the lower classes, modest family plots for respectable citizens, towering mausolea for the wealthy, with inscriptions longer than a modern resume and more flattering by far. Some were shaped like altars, others like miniature houses. A few were so grand that tourists stopped to stare. Literally, tourists. Roman travellers would pause on the way into town to admire the graves of famous generals, writers, and people who claimed to be both. This created a certain post-mortem neighbourhood dynamic. Rich families competed for prime visibility. You wouldn't want your tomb to be upstaged by the Corneli next door. Not after what they said about your figs last Saturnalia. So tombs got taller, inscriptions got longer, busts and statues multiplied like rabbits at Lupercalia. There was a tradition of installing benches near tombs, so that passers-by, and especially relatives, could rest and remember. These weren't symbolic. Romans actually picnicked with the dead. Bread, cheese, wine, the occasional dried fish. You weren't being rude by eating near Great-Aunt Octavia's ashes. You were including her. After all, she probably paid for the bench, and those funerary clubs we mentioned earlier. Many of them pooled resources for shared tombs. Think of it as a posthumous co-op. You paid your dues in life. not always in money, sometimes in labour or favours, and in exchange, you were guaranteed a spot in the collective eternal rest, often with a modest plaque reading something like, "Here lies Marcus, club baker, who once brought 3 extra loaves to the solstice feast. A legacy." Children were sometimes buried in family plots, but infants and slaves might be buried elsewhere, hastily, anonymously, sometimes with only a pottery shard scratched with a name. Death wasn't always dignified, even in a society obsessed with dignity. And then there were the elaborate tomb gardens. Yes, gardens. Some tombs included little patches of greenery, not just for beauty, but because the Romans believed in nurturing the dead. Vines, rosemary, myrtle, they created a peaceful air, and in some cases practical shade for mourners who had to endure long ritual readings. Tombs could be upgraded over time. You died modestly, but your son made consul. Excellent. Your ashes are getting a marble facelift. A new bust, a fresh inscription, maybe a mosaic floor if he's feeling fancy. It was a bit like a LinkedIn update, posthumous edition. But there was danger in grandeur too. If your tomb was too nice, too flashy, too close to the road, well, thieves noticed. Tomb robbing wasn't common, but it happened. Sometimes not for valuables, just for construction material. Bits of marble and terracotta were expensive. Why buy a new lintel when Uncle Gaius's tombstone would do just fine? Still, the Romans tried to deter such desecration. Inscriptions often included threats, not just curses from the gods, legal threats. This tomb is protected under the Lex Papia. Any person who disturbs it shall be fined 100,000 sestertii and forever dishonoured. Whether or not this was enforced is unclear, but the warnings carved in stone made the point. Even in death, property was sacred. You might wonder how all this played out in the provinces. Roman funerary culture travelled well. In Gaul, in Britannia, even along the Euphrates, Romans and Romanised locals adopted similar practices. The inscriptions might be in local dialects, but the message was the same. I lived, I mattered, don't forget me. And sometimes the most touching tombs weren't for humans at all. Romans buried their dogs, their birds, even their favourite monkeys. Epitaphs to beloved pets survive, and they're heartbreakingly sincere. To Iris, my lapdog, who never barked without cause, who lay at my feet during storms, who licked away my tears. Sometimes it's not the emperors or generals who feel most human. It's the man who missed his terrier. You might have hoped that, once buried, your work was done. But legacy is labour, and in Rome, death was just another career, one where you were judged by how well you managed the aesthetics of your absence. And so your bones rest, your inscription glows in the afternoon light, and passers-by, hurried, distracted, glance briefly at your name before continuing on. Some remember, most don't. But in Rome, even being glanced at in death was a kind of immortality. Ah, you're back. Still warm from the last chapter, like bread fresh from the oven, slightly scorched around the edges perhaps, but otherwise still doughy in the middle. Welcome, you're doing well. Really you are. You've survived Roman inspections, grain shortages, and at least one confrontation with an exasperated overseer whose main form of communication is yelling while holding a paddle. Let's see how you fare now, shall we? You might want to lie down for this one. Perhaps close your eyes. Imagine the smell of flour dust, the warmth of a communal oven, and the vague sense that you're being judged by every passing matron with a shopping basket full of olives. Let's ease into it. The Roman bakery, by this point in the day, is a crucible of chaos masquerading as organised labour. It's the hour of deliveries. The neighbourhood's entire culinary destiny depends on you and your cohorts not mislabelling the loaves. There's no room for poetic licence or crust-based interpretation. If you send a sesame-crowned panis quadratus to the family who requested barley sourdough, you might as well have insulted their ancestors, and they will remember. Forever. Each household has their own standing order, their own preferences, and most crucially, their own grudges. Some believe their bread should be the warmest. Others insist theirs be sliced, a rare luxury, or that their loaves bear a stamp of a family crest pressed into the dough, as though they were sending it into battle. This is not just food, it's a statement, a status symbol, a political declaration made with wheat and yeast. You, dear listener, are the one who must deliver this edible diplomacy through the winding alleyways of Rome, dodging pickpockets, stray cats, and that one vendor who keeps trying to sell you second-hand tunics that smell of fermented turnips. With your basket strapped to your back, you're off, like a sweaty Mercury, bearing not messages but carbs. Along the way you run into a fellow delivery boy who offers to trade routes, because his include fewer stairs and more tips. Do you trust him? Of course not. His sandals are too clean. You push forward, climbing uneven steps, navigating bustling markets, and nearly tripping over a tortoise someone dressed in miniature armour for Saturnalia. Festivities spill into everything, even your job. By the time you return to the bakery, your feet ache. Your tunic sticks to you in ways that are both intimate and unwanted, and your arms are dusted with a flour sweat mix that no Roman poet has ever tried to romanticize. You are a ruin of a human, but you made it, mostly, until the magistrate's assistant arrives. Ah, yes, Rome's finest bureaucracy in human form. They're here for their daily order, 6 loaves, precisely baked, perfectly proportioned, and warm, but not too warm. 1 overbaked crust and you risk an audit. 2, and you might be visited by the tax collector who speaks only in sighs and writes fines in triplicate. The assistant inspects the bread with the reverence of a priest handling relics. He lifts 1 loaf, sniffs it, nods. Then another. A pause. A suspicious narrowing of the eyes. He sets it down slowly. This one, he says, is lighter than the others. By a finger's width he gestures meaningfully, as if invoking Jupiter himself. You freeze. You smile. You begin to explain that perhaps the dough rose more due to humidity. After all, you're not Poseidon. You can't control the air. But he's already scribbling notes on his wax tablet. You'll be hearing about this. Probably in Senate complaints. Your name will be scrawled next to unbalanced distribution of sesame seeds. Still, the bakery lives on. Evenings are quieter. The heat settles. The ovens begin to cool, and the apprentices mop the floors with grim resignation. One begins to sing. A low, off-key melody about a girl from Tiber who ran off with a charioteer and left behind only an amphora and a pile of unpaid debts. It's tragic. It's oddly catchy. You take a moment to sit, just for a minute. Your legs throb, your hands are raw, your nose still twitches with the memory of flour dust. Across the room, someone sneezes and causes a small flour explosion. No one reacts. You think back to your dreams of working in a bakery. Simpler times. Hazy fantasies of peaceful bread making and early retirement. Instead, you've learned how to argue with customers, how to fend off feral dogs, how to avoid getting locked in the grain cellar, and, most importantly, how to pretend everything is fine when someone forgets to add salt. And yet, As the last rays of sunlight creep across the terracotta floor, you admit it. There is something beautiful here, something ancient and rhythmic. Bread was life in Rome. It fed the people, soothed the gods, and occasionally got thrown during riots. And today you helped make that happen. Let's not dwell too long, though. You still have dough to knead for tomorrow's batch, and a mouse to chase out of the pantry. But don't worry, we'll finish soon. Just one more part to go, and perhaps, after all of this, a little nap. You made it. Well, most of you did. A little worn around the crust, perhaps. A few burns here and there, on your arms, your ego. But you're still here. One full day in a Roman bakery. Give or take a few minor health code violations and one emotional collapse next to a bag of millet. Let's not pretend you haven't been tested. You've risen before the sun, handled grain deliveries with the efficiency of a panicked goat, survived the flour rations, the collapsing kneading table, and the daily gauntlet of customers who believe their loaf should be baked with the blessings of Venus herself. And now, as night finally wraps its arms around the streets of Rome, your shift is technically over, or at least it would be, if it weren't for the night batch, because bread in Rome never truly sleeps. There is always a festival tomorrow, always a senator's feast, always an anxious mother demanding 12 honey rolls for her daughter's betrothal breakfast. So the ovens stay warm, and you, despite your desire to crawl inside one and disappear, must remain. The bakery at night is a different beast. Quieter, yes, but not calmer. It's the hour of reflection, of recounting how many loaves were burned, how many customers lied about their change, how many rats now live behind the olive barrel. Your fellow bakers are ghosts of themselves, smudged with soot, their tunics clinging in all the wrong places. You exchange glances that say, without words, "We're not doing this forever, right?" And yet, none of you leave. Because here, in this tiled, oven-lit tomb, something oddly tender unfolds. There's less shouting, more humming. Someone brings out wine, not good wine, of course, but warm and vaguely grape-adjacent. You sip. It burns slightly. You pretend not to care. And then it happens. The storm. Rain in Rome is no gentle affair. It doesn't ask permission. It arrives like an angry debtor, kicking over stalls, flooding alleyways, soaking tunics and turning flour into paste. Thunder cracks above the rooftops like Jupiter dragging furniture across the sky. A gust of wind flings open the bakery shutters, scattering scrolls and sesame seeds alike. But no one panics, not here. The rain, oddly, brings relief. The world quiets. Fewer customers, no deliveries, just you, the bread, the ovens and the storm. Someone laughs, not at anything in particular, just the absurdity of it all. You laugh too, though you're not sure why. Maybe because you survived. Maybe because you're too tired to cry. Maybe because there's nothing left to burn. You curl up near the warm bricks of the oven, just for a moment, just to rest your back. You close your eyes, and you can still hear it. The gentle hiss of dough rising, the creak of wood, the soft breathing of your co-workers as they drift into that delicate twilight between consciousness and surrender. Outside, the rain continues. A steady rhythm, like footsteps on a roof. The kind that slows the city, cools the stones, and hushes the dogs. A rhythm that has played for centuries and will go on long after the last loaf is baked. You've made it, dear listener. You've lived a day in a Roman bakery. You've felt the heat, the weight, the grind, and now you feel the stillness. Sleep now. Let the ovens cool. Let the storm sing you to sleep. Let the bread wait for morning.